Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me. I really do enjoy keeping up my connections with students, and with it's a very special time of life. And I think it's really inspiring that you are looking at your faith to provide you stability and guidance. And what I was told was that you are doing a series of Quranic du'as. So I picked a du'a, and I'll share that with you. Now, again, my background, as a chaplain, I have a background in Islamic studies, but I never claimed to be an alima. And so what I do is I have a good grounding in Islamic studies and Islamic scholarship. But that is something that now takes on the color of my profession as a mental health, helping professional, as a psychotherapist, a registered psychotherapist, and as a chaplain. And so, again, sometimes when we have traditional scholarship and halaqas, there may be a different system in terms of how you do tafsirs. And what I would like to add is something complementary to that. And if there is anyone in the audience who has that specialization, I would be more than happy to take that input as well. So the dua I picked out, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Rabbana atina min ladunka rahmatan wa hayyi' lana min amrina rashada. That's from Surat Al-Kahf. That is the 10th ayah. And the translation that I'm looking at, a very basic translation, says, Our Lord, bestow on us mercy from yourself and dispose of our affairs for us in the right way. And so when I hear this dua, I know that we can respond to it on many different levels. The first would be our immediate connection to a conversation with Allah. And it's personal. It fits into the contents of our lives, our needs, and our experience of prayer. So when I'm asking for, disposing my affairs with Allah, that'll be my affairs, my concerns, my difficulties, my responsibilities. My challenges will be for me, different than they will be for someone else. So we experience dua, they will have certain formula that we find in the Quran, but the beauty of the Quran and other inspired scriptures and revelation is that it's something that is timeless, even though it has a context in which it was revealed. It has a context in which we are saying, but it's something that it's interactive. It's not static. And so what I mean by that, when I turn to Allah in dua and I ask Allah to have mercy on me and to dispose of my affairs in the right way, or to handle things, the things that are beyond my control, the things that are on my ability that are still affecting me, I will experience that as part of a personal connection in the context of my life. Now, what I'm not providing, and I think maybe this is homework for people if they want to do, I think you can research that. You can find many scholars that will give certain verses. We know the story of the Surat Al-Kahf, when the youth are there at a time of social turmoil and political corruption and social corruption, that they go to the cave. They think they're just sleeping for a little time and they wake up and it's a century. And so that's how Allah decided to dispose of the affairs of people in challenge. So we understand the context of the dua. I think a scholarly study would also tell you when in the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and in the community of the Muslims, when was it revealed? What was the significance? These are some very rich explorations that could add to our understandings. This is not what I've provided, but I think that this is something that would be very fruitful into really digging deeply into what was the context within the Quran, what was the context within the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the community. And I think that might help us understand how this can get a better appreciation of what was happening at that period of time, both the narrative of the sleepers in the cave, also the history and the context of the life of the Prophet and the early community, peace be upon him, and also how this relates to us and our particular life and time and challenges here. What I can also add to this dua, and why I think you're inviting me as opposed to one of the imams or an alim or a mufti, is that I can add from my experience, what does it mean for me? Where does it connect with my life journey in becoming who I am? And also, and that's part of sharing my lived experience, and how can this inform me in my particular context of work? as a chaplain and a psychotherapist. So the first thing, in order to understand the lens in which I would see this dua, now beyond, that's right, beyond what it means to me as a person of faith who's journeying towards Allah, what does it mean in my present role and functions in mental health as a chaplain and a therapist? I think that the first thing is, if we get a context of that whole, and now I'm going to move away from the dua to understand where I'm coming from in my context, where I'm looking at mental health and I'm looking at faith. And the first things to understand is, and I'm going to use faith and religion somewhat interchangeably, even though I know they're not. I know in Islam, we talk about deen, way of life, not specific religious rituals that are apart from our life. But still, whether we mean way of life, faith, or religion, we're talking about something which includes a set of beliefs and practices that are supposed to inform our life and guide us. And so sometimes, unfortunately, religion, and Islam is a religion, it does not always have a positive experience. So faith and good mental health do not have on a uniform one-to-one relationship, that if you have faith, if you express that in religious behavior, you will always have good mental health, and vice versa. Sometimes it does have a good relationship. Sometimes it has a neutral relationship. Sometimes it has a negative relationship. So I'm aware of that. In fact, I'm thinking a book. We had a seminar on spirituality and psychotherapy that was by Kenneth Pargament, who's a really world-class scholar. The Royal Ottawa Mental Health Center had provided this. We talked about a book by James Griffith called Religion That Heals, Religion That Harms. And it's very, very fascinating. It's not written specifically about Muslims, it's about religion in general. And it starts out, and we're not evaluating the faith content. Is this true? Is this a revelation? Do you feel that connection from Allah? We're talking about the outcomes in terms of mental health. And so this is applied across the board to any religious faith, that often religion will provide certain very helpful functions. One is that it can give a sense of belonging. It connects you to the community, and it connects you to something beyond yourself. And this is very important for well-being, mental well-being. The other thing is that it provides moral boundaries and a moral compass. What will stop one person from aggressing over another, from transgressing, from being a zalim, from taking what doesn't belong to them, harming others? And so the idea of being a moral being, having regulation and self-discipline. Now, this is so that not only for ourselves, when we regulate ourselves, but so that we don't transgress against others. So religion provides this type of discipline, which is a very helpful aspect, both in our own personal mental health and our relationships and in our communities. The third thing is, religion often provides an answering to suffering. Our path, no matter how many opportunities we have, at certain points will involve loss, suffering, death. And religion often provides solace and healing. What happens on the flip side of this is, when religion harms, is when a sense of belonging for a group that gives a sense of continuity, sometimes they get that sense of connection of who's in the group by defining who's out of the group. And even though there's a great sense of security because you have that in group, we're the saved, we're the believers, we're the this, we're the that, when it is done at the expense and dehumanizing other people as unsaved, unguided, this, that, what happens is that it can not only lead to loathing and hatred, that is at the root of many acts of violence, where one group feels that they have God's permission to disregard the rights and the access to resources or to life or liberty of people who are outside the group because they're less than. So that's the function where religion can in fact be very harmful. And if we're feeling very, very comfortable because we know we're saved, and we look at other people as less than, or only potential is maybe they'll convert, then we've done some process of dehumanizing that corrupts our faith. And in terms of mental health, starts us on a path that is not healthy. And religion can do this, including people's belief and practice of Islam. And sometimes, unfortunately, this is labeled as piety, but it's piety that, left unchecked, can lead towards hatred and is also a predisposing factor for people for extremism and radicalization. So connected to Allah, sense of community, sense of believers, feeling that we have the right message, that's part of our confidence and our security. When it dehumanizes others, our religion has become harmful. Second thing, moral compass, rules, regulations, self-regulation, learning to live with limits is helpful. But when we don't have healing as well in balance, if you add this religious idea of this rule, that rule, this rule, that rule, and all of these things become necessary because, you know, we need to guard our nafs, we need to guard our lusts, we need to guard our greed. Like if we make religion all about following rules, very often this can lead to imbalance. Anybody who's had issues with, let's say, OCD behavior, there's a whole area of OCD, you know, the obsessive compulsive disorder. When it comes in religious context, there's a special word for it. It's, I think it's scrupulosity. I hope I'm not mispronouncing, but it's a specific type of mental health disorder that uses religious language. And we know about this in terms of, sometimes we call it the waswas, when somebody is so worried about losing their wudu that they keep doing their wudu over and over again and actually miss their prayers. So at that point, that worry about correctness of observing rules, whether they're religious ritual rules or they're moral rules, can become something that leads to a life of imbalance. And so the rules are there. I often say the rules are there in order to provide protection and guidance for something else, which is life-giving. But when we become so preoccupied with the rules that we can't look at the nourishment, the well-being, the sense of having self-compassion, self-care, our religion becomes imbalanced. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when I talk about the word Rabb in here. And Rabb has, and I don't want to foreshadow, I guess it's foreshadowing what I want to talk about later. It has connections to symbolism of like a gardener, a nurturer. And so if you're going to have plants that grow, you need more than self-discipline. You can't grow it, yell at something or discipline something and get growth. You might discipline something so it grows straight, so that it's not encumbered by weeds, but there has to be some other nurturing and life-giving characteristic. So when we get too much into rule behaviors, we can become unbalanced, we can become unpleasant to ourselves and to others, because we miss the point of what those rules are supposed to contain and support. And I think the final thing is with suffering. I mean, I'm not sure what the flip side of religion providing solace for suffering. I think sometimes when we have issues of grief and loss, or we're dealing with people with palliative care, or they've experienced a death, we have to be very careful not to give a religious platitude and say, oh, it's fine, you're going to go to heaven. Or it's like, isn't this wonderful? Don't worry, it's all going to be saved. You're all. Those words can provide solace, but if they minimize the sense of grieving and loss, for somebody who's lost something and they're being told all of the spiritual benefits they're getting, there's a real disconnect and it hurts. So I think, again, answering to suffering and loss is being present in suffering, not whitewashing it and saying, well, we've got a religious answer and we've got a reason why you shouldn't really feel the suffering. That is disrespecting the experience of the person who is in pain at that time. So looking at faith and mental health, we look at Islam and faith as a way that helps us, it connects us to God, it provides us those aspects of healing, but we also have to be careful and to be alert for the ways in which religion, including our faith in Islam, can leave us imbalanced and unable to find that health and well-being. So again, I think it's one of those things that when you talk about faith and you talk about piety and you talk about halal and you talk about all these things that are very important parts of being balanced as a Muslim, you don't just look at the external, you look at how it's functioning and how it's impacting you. And is this leading you to balance and well-being? Because that should be the outcome. And I think also another thing to understand is Islam and mental health is to really understand the essential concepts in Islam. And one of the things, I think it's becoming more well-known now, but I repeat it pretty much in every gathering that I'm asked to speak. We tend to translate Islam as submission or surrender. And certainly surrender of the ego, that there's something beyond us. The world does not rotate around our convenience, our wants, our preferences. That's a good part of faith and a good part of good mental health. But that is a derivative meaning. The root word means in itself seeking, continuous seeking of healing and wholeness. And when we remember this definition of Islam, then it helps be a corrective against overburdening ourselves with, did you follow that rule, that rule, that rule, that rule? And, uh-oh, you missed your Sunnah prayer. I guess you're not as pious as so-and-so. It gets us away from a quantifiable faith to a more qualitative faith, where it's about connection, it's about state of being, and those tools and supports of our practices are helpful in that outcome. So what I would say, I guess the final thing, and this is just about religion as part of, so I guess I would say religion can be, when we talk about people with mental health situations, religion can be the contextual factors. It can be the demographic, it can be understanding the culture, it can be understanding family relationships. That's important to know. It can be something which is used in harmful ways, as I've described, or it can be used in helpful ways to make connection and to elicit hope. And it has been proved by evidence-based research in the field of counseling that the greatest factor for healing, the greatest factor for positive change when you're dealing with clients that have experienced distress, is the elicitation of client hope. And this is said without any references, not by religious people. These are by people, researchers looking at empirical evidence. You can have a great therapist, you can have someone with a skilled intervention technique, you can have a certain type of approach to the issue, whether it's CBT or let's say reality therapy or emotionally focused therapy. You have different ways of addressing mental health issues, but the strongest factor in healing is elicitation of client hope. And so if Islam comes as part of your hope, that's the thing that can make change. And whether we see it as Muslims, as Allah's barakat coming and lifting us up, or whether it may be non-religious clinicians who are saying, wait, I'm seeing my client get better. When they have a faith that connects them to something that brings them hope, that's when healing can happen. So this background is just a bit about, what do du'as mean for me as a mental health professional? And very often the clients, I spend most of my time as a chaplain with the military, and some I still go to the OMA, University of Ottawa. I do some community chaplaincy. I do have a small private psychotherapeutic practice, and most of the clients who seek me out are clients who want to have something Islamic in their healing. I mean, sometimes they seek me out because they understand that I will get some of the context in which they're coming from, some of the different dynamics in marriage and extended family. But most often they want to get from a place of being stuck and distressed to a sense of hope and healing. And for them, Islam is really important. And so we can use du'as, we can use reflection and zikr and prayer as part of the healing process. I did most of my other work before this stage. And when I was doing my practicum placement, I had almost no Muslim clients. It was all mainstream in a college. And I found I'm doing the same type of therapy, only I'm using a different language. I won't use a verse of the Quran. I won't suggest dua, but there's the same process of connecting to something beyond yourself, and to find that nurturing presence is something that, or even people who are not religious, there's words that we can use to point to a reality that's there in Allah's sunnah that has an effect for health and healing. So that's just a background about du'as in general and how I'd approach this as a Muslim psychotherapist who is sometimes working with Muslims, sometimes working with others. I'm always Muslim. I always have this vision. Whether or not I'll use a specific du'a, I will understand how du'a will, and things that provide that healing connection and presence, they lift people up. And if they can, if that's something that's from them, you don't impose this on anyone, but if this is something that is part of someone's way of looking at the world, you give them those tools and it lifts them up and it provides them a start to healing, and it's very powerful to watch. So now if we look more at the specific dua, there's words that I find very powerful. And again, I am not a classical Arabic linguist. What benefit I have is working with people in the community and with scholars and leaders that have this facility. So what I do is I have an ear. When I listen to someone who has these abilities and is able to do this very deep type of interpretation, I will take things and say, wow, when I'm looking for something healing and life-giving from our tradition, I'm finding this. So the first word I would come to is Rabb, when we have Rabbana. And I have a very, I want to say intimate, but I have a very close connection with that word. And it comes from, being raised as an Anglophone and as a Christian, I would hear Lord. Whenever I hear Lord, it's usually translated as Lord. My first connotation was Lord of the Manor. So whether it's the Lord, it's nobility, it's somebody with authority, it's somebody sovereign Lord you're a little bit afraid of. And sometimes you kind of project that as Allah is the Lord in the sky, like an angry monarch who's kind of, it's kind of scary and has a kind of arbitrary authority that if you don't please the Lord, you're going to be in trouble. And so this is my connotation of what Lord means in English. And it took me like a few decades as a Muslim to realize, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe when I see Lord in a Quranic translation, that isn't actually what Rabb meant. And after spending some time with a very good linguist, who also was an expert in Quranic tafsir, it was explained to me that actually the root of Rabb is not, divine, authoritative, sovereign in the sky or all around us. It's divine mentor, it's nourisher. And there's even a symbolism of dripping water onto the roots of plants to gently nourish their growth. And it's nourishing vertical growth. So when I think of Rabb, instead of that difficult to please, monarch that's scary and I'm always a little bit on guard and maybe walking on eggshells, it is a power, but it is a nurturing power. Vertical growth means just that maybe there's discipline involved, but there's something that is interactive with a source of life and encouragement. And so when I think about this in psychotherapy, or sometimes psychotherapy is undoing and redoing some of the damage that's done in our own families of origin and our early relationships, when you deal with someone in the process of growth, even if they need corrective feedback or discipline, when you do this with the vision of understanding what is the potential in them that can blossom forth, like a seed which is planted, and we don't know what's going to happen, but if we nurture it and we discipline it and we prune it when necessary, something beautiful happens. And so when we are dealing with people, let's say in a parent-child context, even if we need to discipline something, even if we're unhappy with what's happening, if that corrective discipline is given with the vision of how good you could be, I care about what you're doing and I want you to correct yourself because I know who you can be. I know the beautiful fitra that Allah has placed inside you. And I want to make sure you're not sabotaging yourself from blossoming into that beautiful creation, from actualizing that fitra. And so again, it does involve discipline. It's not a free for all. Don't listen to anybody. I do whatever I want. It's not that kind of nafs expansion, but it's different from simply using that kind of oppressive discipline, that there's never something that balances that with life growing. So when I see Rabb by itself, that word is one of proximity. It's not of harshness. It's one of nurture. It's one of nourishment. It's one of mentoring. And so that's the first thing that I would pick out in that verse. And that's a very powerful word, not just for us in prayers, but as an approach. If you want positive change, if you can validate the person's potential, you're much likely to get that positive change than if you criticize them for head to toe everything that's wrong with them. So this is not just a different approach of one is better than the other and one is nicer than the other. If your goal is to produce positive change, that happens with that vision towards potential and rising up to that potential rather than a diminishment of the person so that you define them according to the worst of their behaviors. So that's the vision that Allah has of us in this dua. The next word that comes will be from the word rahmah, or from rah. And I think this is something that we discuss a lot, like the root of that for mercy, rahamim, is meaning womb. And so of course the symbolism is there of a mother's unconditional care and comfort. So mercy is grounded in that concept of the same way that a mother nurtures and cares and comforts. So there's different derivatives. We have Rahman and Rahim, you know, in the first Bismillah Rahman Rahim. And these various ways of changing those root words have different connotations. And if I were to put it here in terms of therapeutic support, and again, therapeutic support is very often recreating those bonds and those conditions for growth, development, and change that if they're done right in the family of origin, that fitra blossoms. When something has hurt it and put it in distress or stunted it or failed to let it grow, then that's when sometimes corrective and reparative means are necessary, where mental health will come in. So Rahman or Rahim, Rahman is more like that divine mentor that will give us that corrective discipline if we need it, but with the eye of our potential. Rahim is a more intensive form, and that would be that unconditional regard. And I'll give you an example. If you have a child who is in distress and breaks all kinds of things and does all kinds of damage, and really, you can, if you really understand that this is happening in distress, it may be what you need to do at that moment. Maybe they had terrible news. Maybe they feel ashamed, they feel anger, and they do something. At that moment is not the time for judgment. It's that unconditional embrace, regardless of what they've done. It doesn't mean that we're not accountable, that, forgiveness is easy. It's unconditional love that will comfort and ground the person. And from that position of grounding, then you can ask them to take responsibility and to be accountable. And I'm thinking in Rogerian counseling, we talk about the unconditional positive regard. That's the starting point, that when the therapist can come in and see the person through that light, that is not agreeing with or validating poor actions. It's validating the person and the fact that they are, in Muslim view, if I were to take from Rogerian counseling and go into the Muslim framework, every person is a creature of Allah. Every person has in them the fitra of Allah. Every person, we don't believe in original sin. We believe in goodness, right? Sometimes we do things that harm us. Shaitan can harm us. Our environments can handicap us, but we don't believe that we're born sinful. We're born good. What we do afterwards sometimes makes it hard for us to be all that we can be. And so I look at this as being able, in a therapeutic alliance, I want to have that non-judgmental total validation in my view, because that's the thing that helps get the motivation to want to heal, to want to correct, to want to be beautiful, to know that one can be better than the way they're behaving at that time. So these are really powerful words that are in this dua that means something to me as a psychotherapist. The other thing I would think is the meaning of turning things to Allah, who is the disposer of our affairs. I have something that I say very often. Good mental health is having an accurate view and relationship with reality. And so part of that is understanding what is within our control and what is outside of our control. Sometimes our distress will come from circumstances that are outside of our control. We might try to influence it. We may try to influence how we feel about it, how we react to it. But there is a point where we have to acknowledge and let go of those things outside of our control. When we try to control them and they're truly outside of our control, we do not end up in a good mental state. In another context, I don't know if anybody's read this very interesting book called Designing Your Life. They talk about this was a book of development, career and personal development that was written by engineers, and they call gravity problems. If you decide that gravity is a problem for you and you want to fix it, good luck, because gravity is going to be there. If you decide that if I jump, I'm not going to fall, guess what? It doesn't matter what you decide, you're going to do it. So if it's a gravity problem that is just in the nature of things, maybe don't spend so much time complaining about that it's there, or trying to come up with another solution, because it may be something that you have to learn to live with. And so this idea of turning things over to Allah, there is the caveat that you're not being passive and saying, oh, Allah, you do it for me. And the examples we have is somebody who says, oh, I made so much dua that I'm going to lie under the tree and the food is going to fall into my mouth. That isn't the Islamic way, because we're people of activity and responsibility and accountability, and we're supposed to build in this world. But at the point where our personal decisions and actions meet their limit, what do? We turn things over to Allah, and we have that kind of, it's a positive acceptance. It's not a resigned give up. It's recognizing what is within our control and what is not within our control. We can still implore to Allah through dua. And I think we have to be careful. There's a dua which is like, this is what I need. This is what I want. Please help me. Be with me, Allah. That's fine. It's like, Allah, I need this to happen. I'm going to say this 1,000,000 times until you happen. That seems to be more a mechanization of trying to force Allah to do something. We don't have control, and that's frustrating. So we're going to try and add Allah to our side and get control. There is a time when something's beyond your control. You ask, you request, but you accept. It happens or it doesn't happen. That's in the qasmat, that's in the wisdom of Allah. So again, good mental health is recognizing what's in your control, and at some point knowing what's not in your control. But instead of passively giving up and feeling defeated, you say, but Allah, you are still there. I'm going to trust you to be the best disposer of our affairs. And if you can get insight, when you lose things and when things don't happen the way you want, it can be very distressing. And I will be very, very honest. I don't have this great patient resignation, a door slammed in my face. I'll be very unhappy. But I know a life experience that some of the doors that have slammed in my face have led to the greatest opportunities. Some of the things that I've lost have led to the greatest gains. Some of the greatest disappointment and heartbreaks have made me look in other things that were much more creative and fulfilling potentials. So again, you leave and you dispose of your affairs in Allah's hands. You don't quit having preferences. You don't quit having pains when things don't work out the way that you want. But if you have that sense of trust, then whatever you're given, you can work with. And we know the adage, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Well, it may be that's exactly what you need. And so there's this interactive trust, tawakkul, but also agency. And so this prayer, I think, is illustrating that relationship with Allah, with the factors in your life, and what is that good balance between what's in my hand and what's not. So I think that's really, there's probably other gems that are in that dua that we can relate to. But I'd really like to open it up at this time and see if there's any response or comments or things that people would like to add. So I'm also going to just lean over and plug in my computer so that my computer doesn't turn off. Excuse me for a minute, but I would really like to encourage other people to respond to this. If you're not too shy, maybe you want to turn on the camera so I can see you.